going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Home Built Workshop. I hope you are all doing amazing. We are going to have some fun today. I've got a cool project in store that I can't wait to show you guys. A friend of mine has this old rat rod that's got Holley carburetors on there that are leaking gas through like every gasket, every orifice, every O-ring, every place you can think of is leaking gas. And he asked me if I could take care of it. So I'm going to take off my woodworking and guitar building hat for just a little while, and we're going to put on our grease and gas hat. And we're going to have a little bit of fun tearing these carburetors apart, rebuilding them. I want to let you know that this is going to be a little bit longer video. I don't know exactly how long, but whatever it takes, I'm going to make it all one episode so that you don't have to search around to try to find part 1, part 2, part 3, just in case you're trying to find some information on this exact topic. So before we can tear into it, we got to go remove the carburetors.
Do you guys ever have one of those projects that's kind of a throwback project? Maybe there's some sort of hobby or some activity that you used to do way back in the day, and you haven't done that sort of thing for a really long time, but somewhere deep down, you kind of enjoyed that and you really kind of miss it? This is exactly that project for me. Growing up, I was always into hot rods and V8s and loud engines. We used to race up and down the street and kind of tear up the town and cause a little bit of ruckus. It's been quite a while since I really got a chance to work on anything like that, so when a friend of mine asked me if I'd be willing to rebuild these Holley carburetors on his old rat rod, I jumped at the opportunity. On my old cars, I used to run a very similar carburetor. The carburetor that I used a lot was an 1850 Holley. It was a 600 CFM vacuum secondary. This is a very similar carburetor as far as I can tell, but it doesn't have any choke mechanism or any vacuum secondary mechanism. This carburetor is strictly mechanical secondaries, so in theory, it should be a little bit simpler. We're about to find out. Before I can begin working on this, I need to disconnect all of the linkage, the throttle cable, the transmission shift-down cable, and then I can loosen the 4 bolts that hold the carburetor to the intake manifold, which in this case is a tunnel ram.
Well, that's not even the right gasket. This is open on the intake manifold. Yeah, boy, oh boy. The things you find on some old cars.
Since it's likely I'm going to have this off for a day or so, I'm going to clean up the intake manifold and remove all of the grease, and I'll use some masking tape to cover up the opening. We want to do everything we can to keep any dirt and debris from dropping down inside the intake. That could be bad.
All right. That'll keep crud out of there. Let's go take a look at what we're working on. So here's our project for the day. What the heck is it, you might be asking? This is a Holley 4160 4-barrel carburetor. This is the 450 CFM model. Since this car has 2, they make these smaller ones that are perfect for this kind of application. What we're gonna do is tear this apart, clean everything up, put it all back together with some new gaskets and a couple of new bits and pieces, and get this thing back up and running. If you're getting ready to rebuild a Holley carburetor, there's a couple of things you need to know. You need to know the exact model number. This one is a 9776. The model number you can find typically right on the choke horn here. It's going to be stamped into the choke horn, and you can look up all the parts you need based off of that. That's the most important piece of information you need off your carburetor. Now, some of the newer Holley carburetors do have the numbers stamped or engraved into the sides of the body, but somewhere on the carburetor you're going to find that number, and you're going to need that. But most of the carburetors I have ever worked on, it's always been right here on the choke horn. Once you have that number, you can look up all the parts you're going to need on the Holley website, but just to make sure I got the parts I needed, I spent some time on the phone with the reps at Holley just to make sure I had the right part numbers to order up the rebuild kit. Let's tear this thing apart, go through the cleanup process, and then we're going to tear into this kit. It's not as scary as it might seem. Before you crack open any bolts, it's a good idea to have some sort of a stand. Now you can buy stands like this, but really I just use a scrap piece of wood, drill some holes in there that match the bolt holes on the carburetor, if I can get it off of there. A couple of bolts through there. That's really all you need. Just something to hold it up off the ground. so you can work the linkage and all the gadgets and things on there and really be able to work on it. I've got my workbench back here cleaned off. I'm going to work back here. I've moved all of the wood, all of the guitar parts, and everything out of the way so we can do this project without getting gas and grease everywhere. You'll notice I've got an old towel laid out here, and that is, to me, very important because some of the pieces in here are very small and I don't want to drop something accidentally, have it bounce off the table and never to be seen again. So I like to work on an old towel, something like that, just to help catch all the parts and also protect things. So looking at the carburetor, we have the fuel inlet here. This is the front of the carburetor. This goes towards the front of the engine. The first thing I'm going to remove are the front and rear fuel bowls, get those out of the way, and basically just break this down into the 4 larger segments. Then we'll go through each one, clean each one up, and start the reassembly. In here is the metering block for the secondaries. They take a special tool to get those out of there. They're not even all that tight. Look at that. And gas everywhere.
I do recommend keeping a large supply of rags on hand, and probably a good idea to wear some gloves too, but you guys know me, I always forget that step.
While I'm taking everything apart, I try to keep all of it together so that I know this is the gasket that came off the secondaries. These are all the bolts. Everything is over here. I'll do the same thing for the primaries, but I'll set them in a different location. I want to keep everything together so that it's nice and easy when we get back into the reassembly. Ugh, there's some sludgy grossness in there. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Holley Carbs, you will know that typically screwed in right here is something called a power valve, and I was surprised to see that this does not have a power valve. It does not even have provisions for a power valve. So that's one less thing we have to worry about. Here's our primary metering jets right here. We're going to check out these, make sure that they are the same size as what's going to be in the front. We want everything to be matched. But this is our metering block. This is where you adjust your mixture screws here. We got lots of stuff to clean up, lots of stuff to replace on all of these parts. Before I take these screws off to separate the base plate from the main body, I want to point out a couple of things. Take a look where the screws are before you remove these. If you look on here, there's a couple provisions for some more screws, but there are no screws in here. And really, for the best of my knowledge, what I know about this is for some applications, this is open to the intake. Like on this vehicle, this is all open to the intake. So if there were screws in here and one were to somehow come loose, it's going to tragically find itself down into the intake manifold, and that's going to be bad. So we want to make sure not to put screws back in these 2 locations. We have 3 on the front and 3 on the back, and that's it. Just make note of where they are. There's one last little piece that I want to remove here, and that's the accelerator pump squirter. I think we're going to need to change this out, but we need to take it out so we can check the size, and also it's part of the cleaning process. You really need to remove every single thing that you can possibly remove because there's about a bazillion little passages and things here that we need to spray out. A little pick is going to be one of your friends when doing a project like this. And underneath that squirter is this tiny little piece here. You want to take that out as well so you don't lose it. So I basically have the carburetor broken down into about every piece you can take apart, with a few exceptions. There's some gaskets and things on the top of these float adjustments, some O-rings and stuff like that, but I'm going to give it an initial spray down as it is with a whole bunch of carb cleaner just to get most of the grime off. And then, like I said, we're going to go basically component by component, clean it up the rest of the way, and start replacing parts and putting this thing back together. It's really not that hard. So make sure you have plenty of carb cleaner and shake well before using. Let's do this.
What you can't see here is the fact that I'm wearing safety glasses. Carburetor cleaner comes out at a really high pressure. That's what helps clean. So it's really easy to get splashback into your face. So I highly recommend wearing safety glasses when doing this.
We've got a little bit of junk to scrape off of here, but overall, it looks pretty good. I always check the tabs, make sure none of these are cracked. I've had these break off before. These look just fine.
When you're spraying the parts, you want to make sure you get spray into every single port and passage. These ports are cast into the body and they lead all over the place in different directions, so you just never know which one's going to be plugged, so you got to check all of them. Here you can tell a lot of the different directions the spray comes out as I spray into each port. Some of it comes towards you, some of it goes away from you. It just goes all over.
With a couple of the main components cleaned, I'm going to start on a little bit of the assembly. Now, my process is a little bit different from the way a lot of guys tend to do this. A lot of people will remove every single component, lay everything out nice and neat, and then just work on putting it back together. I like to work on each individual component. That way I don't have everything taken apart all at once. I don't really have a ton of space to lay out everything here. So for me, my process has always been, even back in the day, to start with the base plate. I've got it all cleaned up. I'm gonna first blow everything out with compressed air. Even though we've sprayed it, I still use compressed air to make sure everything's nice and clean. Then we'll get the main body bolted into place, and then from there, piece by piece, we'll work on putting everything back. Now, that's not to say that if you take every single piece off, you're doing it wrong or this way's right. This is just my way of doing it. It's what's worked for me in the past, and it's what I'm gonna do here. In order to do that, though, we gotta pop open this kit. It could be a little bit intimidating if you've never done this, but it's not that bad, especially for this carburetor. Now, this particular kit is Holley part number 37-1536. This is the kit that Holley recommends for this particular carburetor. Inside, you're gonna find an array of things. This kit covers probably, I don't know, 100 different versions, and really, we only need a few pieces out of here. It's kind of a drag that you have to buy this whole kit. I suppose if you knew exactly which gaskets you need, you could order those individually and probably save some money, but since I didn't know what exactly we're gonna need, this is the way we went. When you pop it open, you wanna be a little bit careful because there are some really small parts in here. Sometimes they can get knocked out of the little box and end up in this plastic wrap. I don't see anything loose in there, so I think we're good there. That's the gasket that we're gonna need when we put this back on. I like to carefully take all the documentation out, make sure there's nothing stuck in there that we're gonna maybe need. And there are some good information, little manuals, adjustment procedures and stuff that are helpful, so it might not be a bad idea to keep these around. Nothing's stuck in there. So right away, we're not working on a 2-barrel. We don't need that. There are so many parts in here that at first glance you can get super overwhelmed, but really a lot of these we don't even need because this carburetor has no vacuum secondaries, it has no choke mechanism or anything. A lot of this we don't even need. We're gonna need one set of these needle and seats. I'm not sure yet which ones. Once we take the fuel bowls apart, we'll figure out what's in there and put whatever set we need of these back in. Comes with a bunch of different power valves, which I was expecting to have to replace, but no power valves in this carburetor, so we don't need those. We've got a couple of different accelerator pumps We've got the larger 50cc and a couple 30cc's. 2 of them would be used on a double pumper. This is not a double pumper, so we are going to need this. Different needle and seat mechanisms, we do not need those. This is the diaphragm for the electric choke. We don't need that. We're gonna need one of these. I don't know which one. These come with tons of different options. They have different holes, so we're gonna have to compare when we get there. 2-barrel, that's choke stuff. Maybe that one, I don't know. We'll figure it out. These blue gaskets are the non-stick gaskets. These are the ones that I'm gonna use. And also it was the ones that were mostly on this carburetor anyway. So really, out of the hundreds of pieces that are probably in this kit, we're only going to need a handful of them to reassemble our carburetor. The rest of these are just going to be extra parts, which is always a good idea to keep on hand. You just never know, especially if you plan on doing more work like this, what you might need later on down the road. But I would recommend you brush up on your matching skills. You know that game we all used to play? At least I used to play it. We're going to need to use those matching skills to match the old gaskets to the new ones so that we know what ones we're going to need when we start putting this back together, which is what we're going to do right now. I keep all of my gaskets and I try to keep them all intact. That way I can tell exactly which one came off when we go to choose the right one to put on. As you can see, we have 5, 6 different versions that this could be. So all we do is start comparing them. I know that's not it because that has larger secondaries. Now that one lines up. I always check it from both sides to make sure that I don't have extra holes on either the old gasket or the new gasket. I actually think that's the one. So this is the one we're going to need.
Before beginning the reassembly, I'm going to spend a few minutes with some torch tip cleaners. Just make sure every tiny passage and orifice are perfectly clean and clear. In order to get a good seal when you reassemble the gaskets, the mating surfaces need to be absolutely clean and free of any stuck-on gaskets. A lot of times these will stick, so in order to remove those, I like to use a razor blade, kind of like you would use a card scraper on wood, and scrape lightly the mating surfaces to get them nice and clean. On this particular carburetor, as I'm scraping it, I'm noticing some little burrs and things that are sticking up on the base plate. This could potentially affect the way a gasket seals, so I'm going to use a file very lightly just to file off any burrs. This is going to make sure everything's nice and flat and nothing damages the gasket. I do want to point out that my goal here is not to really remove any material. I'm only removing the burrs, making sure the surface is nice and flat. I did the same filing procedure on the mating surface of the main carburetor body as well. This also felt a little bit rough to me, so I just knocked the burrs down. Now I'll use some compressed air to blow out everything. We want to make sure that there's no filings stuck anywhere.
So remember, no screws were in this location, so I'm making sure not to put them back. Once I have all the screws lightly snugged, I'm going to start going back around and tightening them down. I go in a crisscross pattern to avoid tightening one side too much, just like tightening the wheels on your car. That's good for now. And now, hopefully, that's about the last time we're going to have to tip this thing upside down. Some carburetors do have different check valves and things. This one does not. A lot of times you don't want to tip it upside down because you do risk dislodging those check valves. You definitely don't want to lose them. The only thing this one has is this little guy that goes down in here for the accelerator pump. So that's why we work off of a little stand for everything else.
The compressed air nozzle that I'm using has a rubber tip which lets it seal against each port so that I know I'm getting a good blast of air through every passage.
Next up is going to be the secondary metering block. We got to take this apart, replace a couple gaskets in here, probably do some scraping, find the new ones in the pile, bolt this back on. This backing plate is just kind of a thin sheet metal, so you want to be a little bit gentle with it. These will bend pretty easy. Now this metering plate does have a tiny ridge around the outside edge that is part of the way it seals to the gasket. It's almost like its own little metal gasket. You don't want to go and file away at this because you're going to file that little ridge down. That ridge needs to stay intact, so you need to very carefully clean up any residue that's left on there. There's some very tiny passages down at the bottom, which are basically your secondary jets. You need to make sure those are cleaned out real well. Back in the day, I've had to drill these out to get a little more fuel. I don't necessarily recommend it, but it is a common practice. You can buy different metering plates which are made to be adjusted, but that is kind of one old school trick and definitely one that I've done before. We are not doing that for this. Since this is for the secondaries, I'm going to go to the gasket that was on the secondaries that I've kept aside with the secondary float bowl. We're going to find this guy. I think it's this one. All the holes line up on this side. I'll flip it around, make sure I don't have any others that are blocked off, and everything looks good. I like to give these just a little squirt of WD-40. Rub it in. This is not 100% necessary, but I feel it helps to give a little extra insurance against sticking later on down the road. Who knows if it's worth it or not. Now that will go on here.
Now we can reinstall the screws for the metering plate. I'm going to install them just snug first, then I'll go back around and tighten them down. You're probably going to have to do this a few times because the gasket's going to compress as you tighten each screw. So just keep going around in a star pattern until everything's nice and snug.
Now we can go ahead and get this taken apart, cleaned up. First we'll take apart this float level adjuster on the top. There's a lock screw. There's a gasket here and a gasket here. There's our old needle and seat. We'll make sure we have the same number when we go to put the new ones in. Now you can at this time pull the float out by removing this little E-clip here. I don't really think we need to go that route. There's not really anything in here that we need to change, but you would just pop this little E-clip off, carefully remove that spring, and pull the float off if you needed to change it. These are replaceable. The last thing is to get this little O-ring out of here. These things go bad a lot, so we're definitely replacing those. Time to clean it off.
After spraying the whole fuel bowl assembly with carb cleaner, I'm going to spend some time cleaning off any remaining gasket material. Sometimes the little O-rings deteriorate and they get stuck in there, so I'm going to make sure to scrape and brush them out really well. Don't forget to clean where the gasket sits. You want to make sure that this gets a good seal and you don't have any leaks when you fire the car up. I also like to brush the gasket surface of the bolt as well, just to make sure there's no debris or crusty bits in there. Then we can install our new washers that go on the bolts. To install the needle and seat, I like to spray the O-ring with a little bit of WD-40. This helps it slip into place and prevent it from binding when you screw it in.
This is what adjusts the level of the fuel in the fuel bowl. You can see if I screw this in, the float moves. It pushes on this lever here, which raises and lowers the fuel level. We'll have to do some fine tuning on this to adjust it correctly once it's back on the car. Now we just need to compare gaskets until we find all of the correct ones. This little nut is somewhat directional. There's a little raised portion right here that goes down towards the needle and seat. The top half is nice and flat for this screw to seal against, which also gets a washer. That one.
Now I'll remove the fuel level sight plug and find the gasket for that one.
It's just the match game. Before I put that on, I want to give these one final tighten. Sometimes the gaskets will compress and it'll be a little bit loose. I'm just double checking, make sure I didn't forget to replace anything. The O-ring that goes in there we're going to put in when we put the front fuel bowl on, so we'll leave that off. Now the blue gasket here is the gasket for this rear bowl. So that'll just go in place like that. And then our bolts with our new little sealing washer. Bam! Now the front, which really is not much different than the back. The only thing different we'll do right now, we want to pull these jets out. I like to double check the number on these. This carburetor came with a 58 jet. These are a 69. We're gonna have to get some new jets. I'd like to add a little bit of clarification as to why I don't want to just put these jets in there. On a vehicle, especially like this, where I don't really know a whole lot about it, I don't know its history, I don't know who's worked on it, I don't know what things have been done to it before, so I want to try to do my best to set this back to the original factory specifications. That way I have a baseline, I know where things are, and I know where to go as far as tuning if I need to make some modifications later. Yes, I could just put these jets in and it may or may not run well, but I like to go back to the factory specs and then I can go from there. At least I have a baseline and I know where I'm going. This is why it's important to get the list number off of the carburetor, like I mentioned, so that you know all of the specs for the carburetor, what jets, what everything is supposed to be right out of the box. Then at least you know where to go from there. I don't really want to rely on a change that someone else made, especially when I don't know the history. I feel a lot more confident knowing where I'm starting from, and then we can adjust from there. If we got to swap jets out later, it's really not a big deal, but this one just seems overly large to me, and it's probably what's in the second carb as well. Maybe. I'm going to get a couple of sets of jets ordered, but meanwhile I'm going to continue working on what I can until the new jets come in. We'll remove the mixture screws. We've got to replace the seals on them. That one's crumbling. Oh boy. Now I'll just grab my carb cleaner, spray all this out, make sure all the passages are clear, and we can reassemble this after getting some new jets. So I've got the metering block all cleaned up. We need to reinstall our idle adjustment screws. Get the old gaskets off here, these little tiny cork things. You find the new one. Press that down in there. I'm going to make sure these are not bent. It's got a really delicate tip. If you crank these in too far when you're adjusting them, you can damage that tip. These look fine. We're going to tighten these till it just stops, and we're going to go out 1.5 turns. That's a really good baseline to start out with when we go to fire this up. And I got the new jets. It's time to install these and finish up the reassembly.
They make a special tool for installing and removing jets, but I found it's not necessary. As long as you use a properly sized flat blade screwdriver, it's going to work just fine.
Before we can install the primary metering block, we need to take care of the replaceable parts on here. We're going to replace the accelerator pump first. There's a little spring underneath. We're going to need to reinstall that. In the bottom here's a little check valve, we're going to pull this out. This is just a little rubber thing. Throw that away. We've got a new one. Now, in order to be able to reinstall that new little rubber check valve, we do need to remove the float spring. Carefully compress it. Don't lose it. Ooh, that was close. We'll give that a little shot of WD-40 just to help it slide into place. We'll grab some needle nose pliers and grab this little tab. Pull it up till it seats in, just like that. And to prevent this little nub from interfering with the float or anything, just trim that off a little bit. Put our float spring back in place. Dig out our crusty O-ring, and just like on the secondary bowl, we'll replace the needle and seat as well as the gaskets for the lock screw. These have a little number stamped into the top. You just want to verify that that number matches your new one. This carburetor is supposed to have a 97 needle and seat. There was a 97 in the back, but this one is a 110. That's not the right one. We will be installing the new 097 in the front as well as the back. That way it's going to match. It appears that this carburetor is sort of pieced together, so we're trying to make it as factory as we can. Now, when I assembled the rear bowl, I said that this little nut has a little boss that goes down toward the needle and seat. This nut does not. Again, I think this was pieced together. New washer, adjusting nut. That goes on. And just like the back, replace the gasket for the float sight bowl. It's just a little metal washer, sealing washer. And we'll just match it up here. There you are. Now we can take our metering block with the gasket as well as the fuel bowl gasket, drop that into place, but before we just bolt this on, we got to remember to install our O-rings on this transfer tube. This is what supplies fuel to the rear fuel bowl. This one gets some new O-rings. I give them a little shot of WD-40 to lubricate that O-ring when you pop it into place. Now on the back, this will just pop in there. There we go. And now we can line up this whole thing. Now when you install this, make sure your accelerator pump arm is up, as well as the arm that operates the accelerator pump. I don't know how many times I've bolted it on while this is down below, and then you have to take it all back off. So you kind of got to line up about 14 things at once here. We got our bolts with the new sealing washers. And when you start to snug these down, that's going to pull everything together, making sure that this transfer tube is seated.
Pay attention to the transfer tube with the O-rings as you tighten down this float bowl.
Always go in a crisscross pattern.
It's really easy to pinch an O-ring if you don't have everything lined up correctly.
One last thing I want to do is replace the seal on the back of this fuel inlet. now I need to reinstall the accelerator pump squirter. There's a little washer O-ring gasket dealio, technical term, that goes down inside there. It's going to be this guy. This gets dropped down inside there.
It's kind of hard to tell, but when you install the squirter, you just line it up with a groove on the carburetor and using the new washer and the screw, tighten it down.
I'm going to do one last check on all the screws.
I think it's really important to check the screws, especially on the bottom of the carburetor. If you accidentally left one loose, you can't get to it without pulling the carburetor back off.
Well, there's our freshly rebuilt carburetor. We went from an old wore out leaking carburetor, tore it down to a ton of small parts, replaced a bunch of small parts. Now it's ready to be installed back on the car. Then I got to do this whole entire process all over again for the second carburetor. I'm going to spare you the details with that. The installation is going to be exactly the same as removal, except I'm going to use the correct gasket for this intake manifold. So I'm going to go ahead and get this thing installed, rebuild the other carburetor, and then I'll bring you guys back and we'll see if this thing will fire up. You're going to want to hear it. So I've got the carburetors back on the vehicle. Both of them are rebuilt. Both of them have the same jetting. Both of them have the same needle and seat. They're pretty much set identically. Now it's time to see if this thing will fire up. Before we fire it up though, I want to tell you that I did disconnect the ignition coil and I cranked the motor over, which runs the fuel pump, so that I can fill both of the fuel bowls with fuel. I made a quick initial adjustment to the float levels using these screws here. I've also verified that we do have accelerator pump action on both carburetors. I know that I'm going to have to fine-tune this a few more times, but I wanted to try to get it close initially so that we don't somehow accidentally flood the motor or anything like that. So let's see what happens. I saw a couple of leaks right away. So I got this tightened up. I think I got all the leaks solved. Let's see what happens now. I could listen to that sound all day. Well, there we go, guys. That wraps up this full rebuild process of a Holley 4160 4-barrel carburetor. In my case, I had to do this twice, but the process was exactly the same. I hope you guys found this information helpful. If you're trying to tackle this, make sure you get the list number off of the carburetor so you can order up the proper rebuild kit for your application. Of course, we still have a lot of tuning and things to do, but that's going to vary depending on your setup, your particular carburetor, your engine, and all of that. But hopefully you guys found this helpful. I know I enjoyed this process. This was really fun. Now I got to take a few minutes, clean the shop back up so we can get back to some other projects. Thanks a lot for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time. Why is the thing I need always where I can't reach it? I'm gonna get attacked by geese. Now, some of the newer models do have the numbers in a few different locations, but it's gonna be either stamped, bleeding all over everything. Why am I bleeding all over everything? Ouch.